Thank you for joining us in this video, The Divine Will, Void of the Soul. And we'll explore this mysterious void of the soul that Jesus speaks many times to Luisa of, and how the role of this void is important for our growth in the divine will. We'll also discuss detachment and sacrifice, how it relates to the divine will as well. And let us begin in the name of the Father, and the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. I'd like to start with an excerpt from volume 34, March 18th, 1937. You must know that the love of my fiat towards the one who lives in it is so great that if the creature, not out of her own will, but out of weakness and impotence, does not allow all the acts of my will, or due to the necessity of sufferings, or else her life does not flow in it, its love is so great that it does what the creature should do. It makes up for her in everything. It calls her back to the attitude, the order, the love of my will, so that the soul may be stirred and resume her life together with it. And it does this so that the human life may not be divided or separated from its own. If it did not do so, a divine void would be left. But its love does not tolerate this and acts as a supplier of what the creature lacks, because it wants the divine life never to be missing in her, but to be continuous. Can there be greater love, such as to reach the extent of saying, "Courage, do not fear, come with full trust to live in me. Trust me, and even if you shall fall, of flowing constantly in my fiat, I will compensate you, and I myself will take on the operating part that you cannot do, and I will make up for you in everything. The kingdom of my will is kingdom of love, of trust, of accord on both sides." And this is reminiscent of a phrase that Father Iannuzzi often mentions: do your best and Jesus will do the rest. And this is almost paraphrasing that statement. But you notice in the beginning, Jesus will make up for what is lacking. If what is lacking is not out of the will, it's not out of the human will. In other words, it's not a decision of the human will that this lacking or this deficit should exist. And also I'd like to mention that in the same token, that when Father Iannuzzi says, do your best and Jesus will do the rest, your best is not nothing. Your best is actually just that. You're expected to try your best in growing in the divine will. You do have much to do. I'd like to take the opportunity here to say one of the heresies that we discussed in the 6 top most misunderstandings of the divine will video is quietism. And I run into that quite a bit. And initially I was hearing that from people who were disparaging the divine will, that were not part of it or trying to live it. But I'm hearing it more often from people who are living in it. And what I hear goes something like this. I get up in the morning and I say my prayers, my prevenient act, and it's up to God to do the rest. Well, no, it's not. And there's actually a lot for you to do. And if you take that approach, you'll never get out of the second degree of the divine will, unless for some reason God is very, very generous towards you. And we'll discuss this a little bit further on. Now I'd like to get into how these voids are formed. And before we get into how they're actually used, or what their role is in growing in the divine will. So let's take another passage. This one's from volume 18, December 25th, Christmas Day, 1925. Therefore, first, I want to see that the soul really wants to do my will and never her own, that she is ready to make any sacrifice in order to do mine. Again, it's not just being very passive and expecting God to do everything. And that in everything she does, she always asks me for the gift of my will, even just as a loan. Then when I see that she does nothing without the loan of my will, I give it as gift. Because by asking for it over and over again, she has formed the void within her soul in which to place this celestial gift. And by becoming used to living with the loan of this divine food, she has lost a taste for her own will. Her palate has been ennobled, and she will no longer adapt itself to the vile foods of her own self. Therefore, in seeing herself in possession of that gift which she longed for, yearned for, and loved so much, she will live of the life of that gift. She will love it and will give it the esteem it deserves. And there's a couple other passages, and I want to point out that the void in this paragraph here was formed by longing for the divine will. And I'll make note of that as I go through the next two paragraphs. Volume 25, March 13th, 1929. But this new pain prepares you to receive, and the void is prepared in you, in which to place the new knowledges about the divine will. The pain, the new harrowing death that you suffer because of my privation, is a new call that with arcane and mysterious and enrapturing voice calls me, and I come. In return, I manifest to you a new truth that brings you the new life of your Jesus. Here the void is compared to a pain, and again, this is a pain because of the longing for God. It's the separation of God. Is a separation of our living our human wills versus living the divine will which we were intended to. This is very similar to St. John of the Cross in the Living Flame of Love, where he talks about a void. And let me just read a couple sentences from that. This is again St. John of the Cross. And since its void is disposed and divine, is not communicated to it in union with God, the pain of the void and the thirst are worse than death, especially when a divine ray appears vaguely as though through some crevice and is not communicated to the soul. These are the ones who suffer with impatient love, for they cannot remain long without ever receiving or dying. And he goes on to describe this void in relationship to the three faculties of the soul. And he says the intellect, its void is a thirst for God. The will, its void is a hunger for God. And the memory, its void is a yearning and melting away of the soul for the possession of God, just like is being stated here by Luisa. I want to get into the next very short sentence. Again, this is from Book of Heaven, Volume 34, June 14th, 1936. There where a volition does not reign, the divine order does not exist. How many works broken and not fulfilled? How many divine voids may be filled with passions, with sins? And these divine voids, we can either have them empty via detachment, via sacrifice, via yearning for the possession of the divine will. Or they can be filled with passions, they can be filled with sins, they can be replete with attachments to this earth. And let us move on to the subject of detachment. And to begin, let's start with Volume 2, October 29th, 1899. My daughter, the main thing so that I may enter into a soul and form my dwelling is total detachment from everything. Without this, not only can I not dwell in her, but not even any of the virtues can form its residence in the soul. After this, once the soul has made everything go out of herself, then do I enter, and united with the will of the soul, we build a house. The foundations of it are based on humility, and the deeper they are, the higher and stronger the walls will be. These walls will be built with the stones of mortification, cemented with the purest gold of charity. And notice the correlation between detachment and virtue. And the reason is, when we are detached, we're detached from sins and passion. And detachment displaces those sins and passions, and they make a place for the virtues to take root and to grow. And that will actually be the subject of our next video. And it will take some time to discuss, so let's defer that till then. Let's go to the next topic that I'd like to mention here as part of the Void of the Soul video, which is sacrifice. And to do that, I'm going to look for help from Volume 22, April 8th, 1927. It is my usual way to ask for small sacrifices, depriving oneself of a pleasure, of a desire, of a small interest, of a vanity, or detaching oneself from something that seems to do one no harm. These small tests serve as little shells in which to place the great capital of my grace, in order to dispose them to accept greater sacrifices. And when the soul is faithful to me in the small test, then I abound in grace and ask for greater sacrifices, so as to be able to abound yet more in giving, and I make of her a portent of sanctity. Jesus also mentions that living in the divine will, he refers to it, to Luisa, as the sacrifice of sacrifices. Because actually it is a sacrifice. You are sacrificing your own human will. And you will not be an automaton. You will not be like a robot subject to the will of God. But in fact, it's an exchange. You're exchanging your will for that of the divine will. A divine will which not only you will utilize, but you will possess. I'd like to also point out that some people may be a bit concerned regarding discussion of sacrifice. And again, this is something that's not usually embraced by the human will. And we can look at Luisa's life and what great sacrifice that she provided in order for her to live in the fourth degree of the divine will. But Jesus mentions that when someone is requested to be a builder of a kingdom, it requires much more sacrifice than from those who are just living in the kingdom. So I would not be that concerned that you need to provide the extent of sacrifice that Luisa provided, and that will not be the case. But you will have to perform sacrifices. And as you go through the degrees of the divine will and you advance, you'll find that you have less and less to, let's say, give up. So you go into Lent, which we are in now, in 2022, and you look at what you need to sacrifice, and you find that you have little to give up. But don't worry, Jesus will help you with those sacrifices. Jesus will provide the sacrifice that you need. And I would suggest that it's better for you to provide the sacrifice. First of all, it's more pleasing to God that you're doing that. rather than to depend on God to provide the sacrifice. The other aspects I'd like to point out about sacrifices, similar to what we discussed in the Divine Will Bootcamp video, where we talked about prayer. Prayer itself is an act. Just like prayer, providing a sacrifice is an act. And the reason why that's important is, like an act, it has the quality of reparation. The other important aspect that I'd like to point out is that if you perform a sacrifice in the divine will, because it's an act, again, we talk about this in the Eternal Act video on this channel, it becomes part of the eternal act of God, where all divine will acts exist. And because it's there, it has the quality of not being subject to past, present, or future. It's in the eternal act. It's a continuous act of God. And because it has that nature through grace, it is also available. So many people think that they do a sacrifice for a particular subject. In other words, I'm going to perform this sacrifice and I'm going to give this up and make this sacrifice for my brother-in-law who needs conversion, as an example. Well, it's not one and done with a sacrifice in the divine will. You can use that sacrifice for multiple things in the future as well. It does not become exhausted, in other words. So I just like to point that out so that you understand better the nature of sacrifice in the divine will. So let's move on. I'd like to point something else out as well. So you may be listening to this and thinking, I need to do sacrifices and I need to detach myself, and if I do this, I will merit the gift of the divine will. And that's wrong. It is not something that we earn. It is something that is provided by the generosity of God, His magnanimity. It's a gift. And gifts are provided freely by God. They're not merited. And let me go to a passage from the Book of Heaven, Volume 30, April 30th, 1932. We always give the gifts as effect of our great love and our greatest magnanimity. If this were not so, or we wanted to care if the creature merited or not, if he had made some sacrifices, then it would not have been a gift anymore, but payment. And our gift would be rendered as right and slave of the creature, while we in our gifts are not slaves of anyone. And I'd like to maybe give a couple examples. And one is St. Paul on the road to Damascus, where he was definitely provided a gift, and a gift of conversion, and a spiritual gift as well. Did he merit it? No. He was a slaughterer of Christians. Did Bruno Cornacchiola, who was a seer of Our Lady of Revelation, he was a rogue, he was anti-Catholic, he spoke out against the dogmas, the Marian dogmas of the church. And very much like St. Paul, he was converted instantaneously by our Blessed Mother, in this case, appearing to him in Rome. Also, I'd like to discuss a parable from Jesus as well that speaks to this. And it's a landowner of the vineyard. So the landowner of the vineyard, and many of these parables are spiritual in nature and discuss the spiritual life. So in this case, just to refresh everyone's memory, the landowner goes out very early in the morning and finds some laborers who did not have work and asks for them to labor in the vineyard for 1 denarius. And he goes out later, around noon, and he does it multiple times, till almost the end of the day. He encounters some laborers who were not occupied with work, And he said, look, come to my vineyard, even though it was 5 p.m. and I think work finished 6 or 7 then. He says, come to my vineyard and work. And at the end of the day, he called the laborers to be paid. And he said, bring first the ones that I hired last. And he gave them 1 denarius. And he also gave the ones that were there all day 1 denarius. And when they complained that it wasn't fair that they worked all day and labored for the vineyard, it was very symbolic, all day in the blazing sun, while these that came last only worked 2 hours or so, and they still received the same payment. When they complained, he said, what is it to you how I conduct myself in generosity? In other words, he's basically giving those laborers a gift that came at the end of the day. Did they toil for it like the ones came in the beginning? No. Also, at the end of that parable, he says, those who are last will be first, and first will be last. And that necessarily doesn't speak to what we're discussing here, but it does speak to the fiats. As an example, we're probably going to go off on a little bit of a tangent, but the first fiat, creation, you can look at it as after the second fiat, how great the saints were compared to the prophets that preceded them, because they were blessed with the gifts of the second fiat. And so it will be with the third, or the ones that have come late in the day to work in the vineyard. And the third fiat, those saints of the third fiat will be so much greater than those who preceded them in the second fiat or after the first. And even Jesus relates that. When he speaks of St. John the Baptist, he says, St. John the Baptist is the best, the greatest, born of woman, but he's the least in the kingdom of heaven. I'd like to go into one more passage, and this is, again, going back to the subject of the void. Volume 34, July 12th, 1937. My daughter, only in my will can the soul reach the top of the highest sanctity and enclose within herself as much as it is possible for a creature, a complete act that fills her so much as to leave no void in her, so much so that the good that she does converts into her own nature. If she loves in my fiat, the wave of love pours upon her whole being, invests her inmost fibers, and while pouring upon her, overwhelming her completely in love, it constitutes itself queen and converts its love in the creature into her very nature, but so much that she will feel her breath, heartbeat, motion, step, and the whole of her being as incapable of doing nothing other than love. And this is the same as with other virtues. And again, it speaks to, in this case, we're talking about the completed act or the fulfilled act, which is an act of the 4th degree. So in this example, we're talking about a completed act, which is a fulfilled act within the 4th degree, and it's an act of love. And just as a divine act permeates all time and space, the omnipresence of the act, it also will permeate every fiber of the being of that person, whether it's an act of love or it's an act of virtue. This also speaks to the relationship between a divine act and the author of the act as well. And as always, please like and subscribe so that you can help us promote this content. And stay tuned for our next video regarding the virtues. God bless.